Our next speaker is going to be Mike Ruppert, and he's going to be, hooray, we got some fans, all right. Mike's topic is going to be what didn't happen on 9/11. Mike, of course, is the former LAPD cop who blew the whistle on CIA drug smuggling into Los Angeles, and as a result got forced to resign, or got fired, depending on how you look at it, and has been chasing after the truth ever since. He's got a tremendous newsletter called From the Wilderness, and if you want to visit his website, fromthewilderness.com, you can become a subscriber and a supporter of Mike's. I think you'll find him one of the most colorful 911 presenters that we have. And without further ado, please help me welcome Mike Ruppert.
Hi, everybody. Are we having fun? And we only have, I'm going to talk for 30 minutes, and do you realize that in 34 lectures in 8 countries, I have never spoken for 30 minutes? That's good news and the bad news. The good news is that I don't have to talk for 3 hours about what I'm going to talk about tonight. 9/11 is something that is so intense, but it doesn't need to be overcomplicated, and what I'm going to do for you tonight is to make the exact same presentation I would make if I were a detective presenting a case for prosecution on strictly the issue of the FAA and NORAD response on September the 11th. And you know what? What's so beautiful about this is that it doesn't have to be overly complicated. As a matter of fact, it's so simple, it's scary. As a matter of fact, it's so simple, it may help you to understand why the rest of the world doesn't seem to want to get 9/11, or why the rest of the world doesn't want to deal with 9/11, because there was an old commercial that I used to like in the 1970s for Burger King with a young star named Rodney Allen Rippey. And they handed this young, he was like a 4-year-old boy at the time, a big Whopper, and he picked it up and said, "It's too big to eat." And for many people, 9/11 is too big to eat. But to understand the fact, and let me not mince words here, that 9/11 was not only premeditated, was not only, thank you, facilitated, thank you, God, these guys are good, was not only facilitated by the Bush administration, the Bush administration were, in fact, criminal accomplices, equally guilty of murder with anyone else who participated in those attacks, period. Now, if we can just get the, yay, we did it. Okay, we're in the slideshow mode. Now, very briefly, just to give you an overview. Many people wonder about how such a quote-unquote conspiracy could be carried out. They say, oh, thousands of people would have had to know. The answer is no. How many people in the room have ever participated in a covert operation? One. I have, unwittingly. That's the one that led me to resign from LAPD when I saw that CIA was bringing drugs into the country, and I was asked to become a part of it. I have studied a great many covert operations. I have interviewed a great many covert operatives, and the fact is, you don't need a whole lot of people to know. You need key people in key places. For the first reason, that there's something called compartmentalization, where you only have a person in one room working on a bolt, a person in another room working on a nut, a person in another room working on a screw, and nobody knows what the finished product looks like. That's metaphors for covert operations. But also, you only need a few people in key places. One of the stories that From the Wilderness has broken and will continue to break, and which will appear in a book which I will have out this year. We're probably going to change the title of the book to match our video, The Truth and Lies of 9/11. But we identified in the FBI a man named David Frasca. Now, somebody lent me this. There, David Frasca. The FBI's Radical Fundamentalist Unit at FBI headquarters, who single-handedly suppressed 5 separate investigations, each one of which could have prevented the attacks of 9/11. One of which was the suspension of an investigation into two of Osama bin Laden's relatives, Abdullah and Omar. That was the story broken by Greg Palast at BBC. The second was the Chicago agent, Robert Wright, who was he gave a chilling press conference at the National Press Club in tears, where he apologized to the 9/11 families. He had penetrated Al-Qaeda financing. The next was, of course, the Phoenix memo by Special Agent Ken Williams. You might recall when that came out in 2002, which talked about, gee, there's all these Arab fundamentalist guys taking flight training lessons. Don't you think we might want to check other flight schools around the country? And David Frasca's decision was to suppress that request and suspend all investigations, saying they didn't have time when you can go on the web and get a list of all the flight schools. Of course, there was the Colleen Rowley case, Time Magazine's Woman of the Year, the FBI agent in Minneapolis investigating Zacharias Moussaoui, Frasca's behavior was so brutal it caused her to write an 18-page memorandum, much of which I have quoted in my book, which describes deliberate, willful, malicious actions, not acts of neglect. And then finally, the accidental or intentional destruction of all kinds of carnivore email intercepts out of the Denver office, all of which was ordered by the Radical Fundamentalist Unit headed by Dave Frasca, again, which, had those emails been pursued instead of destroyed, could have prevented the attacks at 9/11. What happened to him? He got promoted after 9/11. I owe a great debt as we go through what we're doing here tonight to two people, two of my dear friends and very respected colleagues, one of whom I just got to meet tonight for the first time. But Nafeez I have met before. Nafeez Ahmed, author of The War on Freedom, who provided some of this research that I'm about to show you, and the other is Paul Thompson, who has the most incredible timeline. I mean, I started this little timeline called Oh Lucy, which caused a lot of people to attack me right after 9/11, but I started exposing things, and it was very successful. It was taken from Lucy Arnaz. Oh, Lucy, you got a lot of explaining to do. And that's where I got the title for that. Paul Thompson's timeline is the sine qua non of 9/11 research. His website is cooperativeresearch.org, and I thank both of these fine gentlemen for the work that they have done. Yeah, they deserve it. All right, now is Phil Berg here? Yeah, there you are. All right, you're the DA, and I'm the dick, as we call them in police terms, coming in to make a case. Here's the law. Consider that an aircraft, this is from the FAA Operations Manual, consider that an aircraft emergency exists when there is an unexpected loss of radar contact and radio communications with any aircraft. Elsewhere, the FAA states emergency determinations under a section called Emergency Determinations. If you are in doubt that a situation constitutes an emergency or potential emergency, handle it as though it were an emergency. No equivocation in language there. Aircraft goes off course, they don't answer the radio, they deviate in any way, shape, or form. If these conditions exist, you can't get a response. This says clearly you shall treat it as an emergency. In the next slide, we talk about Payne Stewart, and Payne Stewart, most of you are familiar with. He was leaving Florida, flying to Dallas, Learjet, massive explosive decompression at 35,000 feet. Everybody dies. The reason why that happened, by the way, was because they had a chest with dry ice on board that wasn't supposed to be there, which affected the pressure in the cabin. Air Force fighter jets were scrambled and flying alongside the Payne Stewart plane within minutes. And this is a quote from stories about that, and Nafeez caught it. Pilots are supposed to hit each fix with pinpoint accuracy. If a plane deviates by 15 degrees or 2 miles from that course, the flight controllers will hit the panic button. They'll call the plane saying, American 11, you're deviating from course. It's considered a real emergency, like a police car screeching down a highway at 100 miles an hour. When Golfer Payne Stewart's incapacitated Learjet missed a turn at a fix heading north instead of west to Texas, F-16 interceptors were quickly dispatched. Indeed, listen to this, the U.S. military has their own radar network, NORAD. They are tied to the FAA computer in order to get information on incoming flights. If a target is discovered without a flight plan or information, or in violation of the same, they will call on the shout line to the appropriate ATC, Air Traffic Control Center, for an ID. If the center sector has no data block or other information on it, the military will usually scramble an intercept flight, and they will likely find 2 F-18s on their tail within 10 or so minutes. Close quote. In the year prior to 9/11, U.S. Air Force and Air National Guard fighter jets were scrambled 67 times on a routine basis under these circumstances and were flying beside the designated target within a matter of minutes, usually less than a half an hour, but the scramble order was issued immediately according to the book. Now, I left some things backstage, and maybe I can ask backstage, there are some papers that I left back there, because I'm going to need to refer to some footnotes. If somebody could grab those maybe and bring them out to me before we get into this. Now, let's look at this thing I call pulling the trigger. This is from a 1998 FAA Executive Order number 760.4J, effective November 3, 1998. It's on the website. That's the website listing. According to FAA regulations, it is the FAA hijack coordinator who issues all requests for the military to provide interceptions and escorts. And no, there's a whole stack of papers back there on the sofa that has footnotes in them I'm going to need. It is to provide interceptors and escorts, and the hijack coordinator will do so, quote, by direct contact with the National Military Command Center. That's in the Pentagon. Now, there was some misinformation spun after 9/11 because we had planes hijacked out of New York, Boston, and Dulles. That's the ones, thank you. Gee, there was some confusion, but what we see here is that at NORAD headquarters, which are in Colorado, there's only one guy who sits on the trigger, just like we saw with Dave Frasca, for all of the hijacked airliners on 9/11. His instructions are brutally clear. There is no leeway for his choice in the matter as to what his options are when certain conditions exist. And here's another quote that from the Associated Press on August 13th. Fighter jets scrambled 67 times properly in the calendar year prior to 9/11. Now, this is a chart that I will be publishing in my book, and for members of the press only, because I only have 15 copies. I have this chart, which is fully footnoted, and you will see up here on the screen that I have a little footnote beside each one, which gives you the source from where I got the information. And we're going to go through this timeline now, exactly as I would do if I was in court, because it's according to this timeline that I can ask questions of witnesses under direct examination. If this happened at this time, what did you do then? And if you did not follow the procedure, why did you not follow the procedure? It is a cut and dried case of direct examination, or if I were a detective, what I would say to a suspect or possible suspect or person of interest in the case. But we go, and you probably can't see this, so I'm going to have to read them quickly, but we're going to go through this. The morning of September the 11th, 8:13. Last routine contact with Flight 11. Immediately thereafter, the pilot fails to respond to a call to climb to a new altitude. Flight 11 took off at 7:59. Source for that, Boston Globe. 8:13, Flight 11 hijacked. Source for that, item number 2. That comes from the Nashua Telegraph. It's also on the NORAD timeline. 8:14, pilot, Flight 11 activates talkback button. Controller can hear conversation in the cockpit. Every commercial airliner has a series of 3 buttons on the control yoke. I may miss up the frequencies. I think it's 7400, 7500, 7600, which are called the IFF, Identify Friend or Foe buttons. One is in-flight emergency, one is hijack, and there's another one for some other emergency. The hijack button was activated on the control yoke, which allows controllers to hear conversations in the cockpit. That source is from Christian Science Monitor. There's a real fine conspiracy theory paper. September 13th, 2003. So we know from these events right now that at this point that at between 8:13 and 8:14 a.m. in the morning, we have confirmation, according to what the FAA would know, that Flight 11 had been hijacked, period. There is no question. At that point, immediately, the scramble order should have been issued. That's the horizontal line that I have on the chart right up here. Now we're going to look at some delays. 8:20, Flight 11 stops transmitting IFF beacon, confirming that it had been activated. In other words, we now know from another source that if the IFF beacon was turned off, that it must have been turned on. NORAD definitely should have been notified. We have more confirmation. 8:20, Flight 11 veers dramatically off course, AM. FAA absolutely should have been notified. We have now 2 or more conditions existing. 8:20, Boston Air Traffic Control decides that Flight 11 is a hijack. Official timeline shows other ATCs are not notified for 5 minutes. That didn't happen 67 times in the calendar year prior to 9/11. Why were they not notified? At 8:20, Flight 77 departs Dulles Airport in Virginia. At 8:24, the pilot of Flight 11 activates the talk button. Boston Air Traffic Control overhears hijackers. The transponder has been off now for 10 minutes. 10 minutes since the point in time at which it was mandatory for the scramble order to have been issued. 8:25, Boston Air Traffic Control notifies other ATCs that flight is hijacking. They don't notify NORAD yet for another 13 minutes. Now, if I had the witness on the stand, and I will show you who the witness is before we're done tonight, the question would be, wait a minute, 67 times this happened in the year prior to 9/11. Now, you're telling me on 9/11 you have a confirmed hijacking, the first in recent history, and yet you waited 13 minutes after you knew, but then you already knew back at 8:14 that it was a hijack. Why did you not, for this 11 minutes here, notify anybody that anything was going on? If we come down to 8:28, Boston Air Traffic Control sees Flight 11 make a 100-degree turn to the south. Air traffic controls confirm they never lost sight of Flight 11. They never lost sight of Flight 11. Now, one thing I'll tell you, I don't think I have the slide in here. It is an absolute lie, and I think I may have it later on. The government has said, gee, when we lost the transponder, we couldn't pick them out of all the other airplanes in the sky. That is not true. We have complete conflicting testimony from FAA people and from pilots showing not only does that highlight the aircraft on every screen in every region, but we know that the Department of Defense, the NORAD radar, separate, has a skin paint capability capable of determining altitude. So nobody ever lost track of anything at any time on 9/11. Boston ATC sees Flight 11 make a 100-degree turn to the south. ATCs confirm they never lost sight of Flight 11. Press accounts confirm that Flight 11's radar dot has been tagged for easy visibility. That means it was on every screen in the region. Even that the plane was being watched by American Airlines headquarters, believe it or not. These contradict the Washington Post story saying that the Boston authorities had lost contact. It's very important to give you the source for that. So I will go back here and say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that's the Washington Post, September the 12th. We come down to 8:30. Now, we know that we have a confirmed hijacking in progress. Flight 11 has been hijacked. It's off course. It's lost control. It's a national emergency. And what is President Bush doing? President Bush's motorcade leaves his Florida hotel for the Emma Booker Elementary School 9 miles away. The journey takes an incredible 25 minutes to go 9 miles. As Bush is leaving, he is asked by a reporter, quote, "Do you know what's going on in New York?" Bush says, he does. Source, 13, maybe good for Bush. ABC News, September 11th, 2001. It's amazing what happens when you get on these things right as they happen. 8:37, Sector Air Traffic Control asks pilot of Flight 175 to look for a lost plane. Huh? The plane is not lost. Pilot of 175 says they can see Flight 11 and are told to keep away. 8:40, Boston Air Traffic Control notifies NORAD of Flight 11 hijacking. Wait a minute, it's been 26 minutes now. We're talking about this line right here, 26 minutes. Since we knew that it was a hijacking, since NORAD, according to their own procedural manual, would have known it was a hijacking, and yet we have a 26-minute delay before the air traffic control notifies NORAD, which is where the one guy who pulls the trigger for scramble is sitting. Why did that happen? Good question. Somebody needs to ask it. We come right down to 8:40. Two pilots at Otis Air Force Base at Cape Cod are told of the hijack, yet no scramble order is given. What? It happened 67 times in the year prior. Source for that, number 16, is the Cape Cod Times, August 21st. They went right out to the air base. 8:42, Flight 93 takes off from Newark after a 40-minute delay. That's kind of interesting. That's right here. 8:42, Flight 175 veers off course. According to the FAA manual, if you have any doubt, you shall assume and proceed as if it was an emergency. 8:42, an air traffic control says, looks like he's heading southbound, but there's no transponder, no nothing. Now from another press report, which is from the New York Times on October 16th, we have a plane off course and no transponder. Now, under FAA rules and procedures, it is axiomatically an emergency and a hijacking. A second set of scramble orders should be given, so we know that the Flight 175 hijacking is confirmed at 8:42. At 8:43, NORAD is notified of the 175 hijack. 8:43. Gee, that's just like a minute later. Now, why did they wait so long for one, do the second one immediately? But listen to this. Over here on the right, it says, at 8:46, scramble orders are issued at Otis Air Force Base to go after Flight 11, 190 miles away. Fighters from closer bases like Atlantic City are not scrambled. 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 impacts World Trade Center. 8:46, acting chief of the, typo in here, Acting Joint Chiefs Chairman Richard Myers claims that he sees a TV report about the plane hitting. Now, didn't we just hear in the FAA procedural manual that the FAA hijack coordinator, now we have seen a scramble order issued very late, is to do this with the National Military Command Center, which is in the Pentagon, which reports directly to the Joint Chiefs. And General Richard Myers claims he did not know that 2 airplanes had been hijacked at 8:46 in the morning. Thank you. The procedural manual says he certainly knew. 8:46, Flight 175 stops emitting a transponder signal 50 miles north of New York City. Other reports state that 175 had turned off its transponder, then back on again and on an unassigned frequency. There is no doubt now that we have an emergency under any circumstances. Over here at 8:46, 3 F-16s assigned to Andrew Air Force Base are flying air-to-ground strike training mission 200 miles from Washington. Instead of being ordered to D.C. at supersonic speeds, they return to base, slowly landing only after Flight 77 hits the Pentagon. They could have been in D.C. airspace within 10 minutes. 8:46, Flight 77 is reported by ATCs to be severely off course. 3 scrambles. After 8:46, National Military Command Center's officials in the eastern part of the Pentagon are talking to law enforcement officials about possible responses. What? The responses are already dictated for them in their manuals. You shall scramble fighters immediately. Now we have a report saying they were debating whether to, there was no leeway. They're debating when it's before them in black and white what it was they were supposed to do. That is, at best, civilly, a civil negligence suit of the utmost extreme. Of course, we believe it's criminal, and I agree that the RICO suit should put all those people in jail once we find out who they are, and we'll get there. All right. I could have said something not quite as nice as putting them in jail, but that's all right. Flight 77 is reported off course. We come to 8:46. Okay, so they're talking about what to do next at 8:46. After 8:46, the FAA has an open line to the Secret Service. They can't manage to follow their own procedures, but they're talking directly to the Secret Service in the White House. It's confirmed by Vice President Cheney. I'll just tell you the source on that real quick, because already I see I'm running out of time. That was NBC News, right after the attacks. After 8:46, the NORAD and National Military Command Center have open phone lines. 8:46 to 9, Navy Captain Deborah Lauer in the Bush motorcade receives a message from the White House Situation Room about the first impact. This is before Bush even walks into. But notice that we already have 3 confirmed hijackings. Yet he decided to go into the room to read to the kids. Why? Probably so he could give a plausibly acceptable denial as to why he couldn't issue the order to shoot the planes down, because he knew that they had to have the attacks. Bush later stated, that, of course, that he saw the video of the attacks and said, oh, boy, that's a terrible pilot. Well, of course, the video wasn't played for hours of the first crash. 8:46, Barbara Olson, wife of U.S. Solicitor General, calls her husband at Justice Department. He calls the Justice Department Command Center and advises of a hijacking. Now, wait a minute. We got the Solicitor General getting a cell phone call, calling the Justice Department, saying there's a hijacking, and yet FAA has not issued scramble orders for all 3 flights. Somebody needs to go to jail. 8:46. First TV and news reports of the plane crashing into the World Trade Center. This is the latest time that Bush over here could have known, been asked by events by a reporter at his hotel when he indicated that he already knew. 8:50, last radio contact with Flight 77. Pilot asked for clearance to a higher altitude, then does not respond to a routine instruction. Otis Air National Guard orders pilots take off 12 minutes after receiving notification. That's nonsense. Flying their F-15s at top speed, 1,875 miles an hour with a supersonic cruise speed of 1,600 miles an hour. If you do the math on the ones that went to the Pentagon, they had to have been flying at 300 miles an hour on this Rush national emergency. 8:55, Flight 77 turns around, more confirmation. I mean, there's no doubt what's going on, but watch these delays that come down here when NORAD and the FAA did not do what it was they were supposed to do. I go through a lot of stuff which we apparently will not have time to do tonight. I'm sorry. A news photographer traveling with Bush entourage overhears a radio transmission that Press Secretary Ari Fleischer would be needed on arrival to discuss reports of the crash. That's before 8:58. Latest confirmed arrival of Bush at the Booker Elementary School, 41. We got 3 confirmed hijackings in place, and he knows about it. And he has not lifted a finger to get anything up in the air. He has not mobilized the military. No executive orders have been issued from the White House, not from Dick Cheney, not from the National Command Authority. Bush is taken to a holding room and briefed by Condi Rice. Boy, there's a woman we can really distrust. Taken to a holding room and briefed, yet he decided to go ahead and read. 9:01, the pilots of Flight 93 acknowledge a general FAA warning. Now the FAA is issuing warnings about cockpit intrusion. Duh. Request to barricade doors. The pilots are not told of the WTC crash. Now I'm using a lot of stuff from the NORAD and FAA timelines, actually. At this time, Bush cannot be approached because he's in the discussions. Flight 17 hits Tower 2 of World Trade Center. This has all happened before the second plane hits the World Trade Center. Now I'm using the government records, ABC News, mainstream news, NORAD, FAA timelines. All you got to do is lay this out and look at it. By 9:05, West Virginia ATCs notice an eastbound plane with no transponder entering their airspace. It's Flight 77, right there. All ATC facilities nationwide are notified that the Flight 11 crash was probably a hijacking, yet the West Virginia ATCs do not notify NORAD that Flight 77 is off course for 18 minutes. Why not? FAA informs NORAD at 9:16 that Flight 93 may have been hijacked. Duh. Look at this. By the book, all fighter aircraft should have been scrambled by this time, and we still have delay after delay after delay. One Air Force pilot at 9:24, codenamed Honey, who piloted an F-16 from Langley, disputes the official version. He says that the call to battle stations was not sounded until 9:24. In other words, even some of the pilots were disagreeing because they can't keep their cover up straight. From 9:27 through 9:30, I got 2 minutes left, boys. Bush talks to Cheney at the White House, but there is no discussion of shooting down Flight 77 or Flight 93. Why? Bush finally leaves Booker at 9:29, and at 9:30, transponder contact on Flight 93 is lost. We come to the next page, 9:32, Flight 77 does that wonderful, what Kristen Breitweiser said, the loop-de-loop over the Pentagon. I love that terminology when she testified, God bless her. And amazing how you learn how to do that with 4 or 5 flight lessons. Dives into the side of the Pentagon, which is under construction. At the same time, the Flight 93 hijacking is confirmed. Now, I won't have time to go through all of this, but I will tell you, and I spoke to Phil Berg today, and he and I are both in complete agreement that Flight 93 was shot down. You cannot have a 5-mile or 4 or 5-mile debris trail. I think the port engine was something like 2.5 miles from the impact site. These multi-ton engines don't bounce 2.5 miles. Multiple witnesses confirm a missile strike on the aircraft, and there were some very strange military planes around that. So when you get to the bottom of all this, nobody did what they were supposed to be doing, and it shows very clear criminally negligent at best behavior. I think you have a clear case for conspiracy here. Now, one thing that's very important, and I'll try to speak like the Federal Express guy here, because I just don't know how to do this in 25 minutes. There was, on September 11th, an operation called Vigilant Guardian underway. And this is a story which was pulled from LexisNexis, and I give credit to Barbara Honegger. I don't think that she has been here. Where are you? Well, stand up. There you are. Barb broke this story, which is indeed perhaps perfect camouflage in a way to discredit, or excuse me, to distract air operations commands and behavior, in some cases by inserting false blips on radar screen, by saying we're going to have some planned hijackings, and isn't it convenient that this was scheduled to happen on 9/11? It's one way to have confused the air response system so that people would have behaved in a way just to give enough time. But the air traffic controllers have no excuse for not responding according to textbook procedures on September 11th with all of the maneuvers of the aircraft which I identified. They were not part of the exercise. If they don't respond, you still have commercial air traffic out there. Now, as I look through this, the key point that Nafiz brought up was that there was one guy who pulls the trigger for fighter scrambles. That's him, Ben Sliney, or Slinny. His first day on the job, September 11th. He has never testified in public anywhere. He did testify in a closed session in Congress. USA Today has a wonderful little clip of him on their website. You can't find it unless you found it. I found it. I've saved it on PDF, but I couldn't save it to an image. I was going to show it and play it, where he talks about clearing the air traffic all around these hijacked flights and opening the doors, and it was called To and Through, and I'll send the link to the right people at the time. But, you know, if I was a detective, and even though my nickname when I was with LAPD was Inspector Clouseau, even I would have been smart enough to know that Ben Sliney is the first guy you got to talk to about what happened with the fighters. Have we heard a word from Ben Sliney anywhere? Has he been called to testify before the independent 9/11 Commission? No, he has testified before a closed hearing, a session of the Joint House-Senate Intelligence Committee. The families, God bless them, of the 9/11 Steering Committee have asked a whole list of questions. But it doesn't have to be much more complicated than that as we proceed from here, because we are all nearing a very close window of opportunity to either make 9/11 into an issue that breaks the whole world situation open, or seeing it pass into the dusty archives of history to be discussed like the events of November 22nd, 1963. Our window, one second, I'll come back to you. Our window is now in the course of the hearings. Our window is, and I will talk about this in more detail tomorrow night, the Supreme Court decision pending upon the secret records of the National Energy Policy Development Group, which is where the motive for 9/11 lies. The deepest secrets of 9/11 lie in that task force. It lies when the Commission's final report is released sometime, I believe it's in late July or August, and certainly it will close forever by the presidential election of this November. My plea to all 9/11 activists is that we have to find the sheet music so that we can all sing the same notes. I would submit to you that if I could make this case to you in 20 minutes, we can make the same case to the American people in 20 minutes, and if we keep it simple, we might be able to crack the nut that we need to crack, that we must crack to save our country, to save our planet, and our civilization. Thank you very much.
That was Michael Ruppert, independent investigator and publisher of the From the Wilderness newsletter. For more info on